This podcast presents an analysis of a visionary speech titled, "A Head of State Proposes the Conscience Alliance," delivered at the United Nations General Assembly by the President of a State. In this address, the leader speaks not only to fellow nations, but to the soul of humanity. She begins by honoring the United Nations for its enduring efforts, especially in responding to a painful dispute involving her country and its neighbor. Despite multiple resolutions, the suffering persists. And so, she offers a bold reflection that political and diplomatic tools, while necessary, often fail to reach the deeper roots of human pain. At the heart of her speech is a formal proposal for a new, complementary intergovernmental body, the Conscience Alliance for Global Stewardship. This entity would not replace the UN, but walk alongside it, focusing on healing cultural wounds, restoring trust between peoples, and addressing civilizational crises through relational diplomacy, symbolic enforcement, and distributed healing. CAGS would elevate voices often excluded from traditional governance, elders, artists, indigenous nations, and spiritual communities. It would prioritize moral authority, cultural dignity, and planetary stewardship over sanctions and resolutions alone. We invite you to listen to this podcast and the full speech that follows. Reflect on the proposal. Share your thoughts. And consider what kind of global architecture might truly serve the future of humanity. Thank you.
Okay, let's dive in. We hear a lot about global reform, right? Usually it's, tweaking the UN Security Council, maybe adjusting financial institutions. But imagine this. A head of state gets up at the UN General Assembly, the big stage, and proposes something completely, radically different. Not just reform, a whole philosophical companion to the UN. A new global body focused not on law or economics, but planetary healing, relational diplomacy.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're exploring today. Our sources are snippets from this really quite visionary speech. It lays out a blueprint for something called the Conscience Alliance for Global Stewardship. CAGS for short. And the speaker, this head of state, frames it not just politically, but with this deep sense of human urgency, while importantly still respecting the UN's legacy.
Right. So our mission today is pretty clear. Pull out the specifics. What's the structure? What's the audacious goal here? And what are these unconventional methods they're talking about? And we need to get not just what CAGS is, but why this leader thinks our current global setup, the one built after the war, is missing something vital, like maybe a soul. The speech kicks off with a really emotional tone, which, you don't often get at the UN. The speaker doesn't just say, "I represent my country." They say they're speaking as a daughter of humanity, with a truth that trembles. That shifts things, doesn't it? It's not just diplomacy. It feels like a moral call to action.
Absolutely. And that call stems from, a perceived failure of the current system. The speaker talks about a specific, very painful conflict, a dispute with a neighbor that just keeps going, costing lives, dignity, even years after the international community stepped in.
And they're not trashing the UN's efforts. They acknowledge the resolutions, the condemnations, all the calls for peace. The machinery of international law did its job, but the wound itself, it's still open.
And that leads straight to the core argument for needing something else, a parallel body. The speaker says pretty powerfully that resolutions, noble as they are, don't always reach the soil where pain grows. Sanctions, even tough ones, don't always soften hearts. And standard diplomacy, it can't always fix what's broken in spirit.
Okay. So the UN handles the political symptoms, the visible stuff.
That seems to be the implication, but it might lack the tools for the deeper cultural, the emotional trauma that fuels these long conflicts.
So if the UN is like the global ER treating, the immediate injuries, this new thing, CAGS, is meant to be more like the long-term therapy, the psychological healing.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. That shift from legal fixes to, let's call it spiritual restoration, that's the big leap here. It's dramatic.
Okay, so if the aim is that kind of restoration, the name makes sense. The Conscience Alliance for Global Stewardship. CAGS. What really jumps out is the emphasis on it being born of resonance, not rivalry. It's meant to complement the UN, not compete.
Exactly. And it tries to carve out its own distinct space pretty clearly. The mission focuses on what the UN struggles with, or maybe isn't designed for.
Yeah.
It boils down to addressing three key contrasts. It's about healing wounds between peoples, not just sorting things out between governments.
Right, because governments make deals, but it's the people who carry the history, the trauma.
Precisely. And second, it's about rebuilding trust, which is deeper than just fixing violated treaties. And third, it aims to amplify the silence of culture, not just manage the constant noise of politics.
That difference between peoples and governments feels critical. Treaties are signed by officials, but it's communities, families, who pass down stories, grudges, things that cross borders in ways politics can't touch.
Correct. And the whole identity of CAGS is shaped around this deeper engagement. It's envisioned as a forum of conscience, a network of kinship. And this is really unique, a tribunal for future generations.
A tribunal for future generations. What does that even mean in practice?
It means deliberately building in moral, intergenerational accountability, forcing today's actors to think about how cultural divisions might echo centuries from now. It puts that long-term ethical weight right at the center.
Okay, now we hit the really big questions. If the mission is cultural, spiritual healing, the structure can't look like the UN, right? With ambassadors and nation states. And the proposal for who gets a seat at the table, it's genuinely revolutionary. So who is at the CAGS table, if not the usual diplomats?
Well, it basically throws out the idea that only states hold legitimate global authority. The proposal specifically brings in individuals who represent long-term wisdom, cultural depth. Think elders, artists, scientists, spiritual leaders, people chosen because they operate outside of, short election cycles and narrow national interests.
Wow, elders and artists deciding global issues. And it's not just individuals, right? I mentioned groups too.
Yes, non-state groups, cities, tribes, indigenous nations. Imagine putting an indigenous nation on sort of an equal footing with a major economic power in this specific forum. It completely changes the dynamics of power and whose voice matters.
That's huge. It sounds like an attempt to democratize moral authority on a global scale.
I think that's the idea. The speech suggests that cities, tribes, places closer to the soil where pain grows might have a more direct, more authentic claim to stewardship than, say, distant federal governments. A city battling sea level rise or a tribe protecting a vital ecosystem. Maybe they are acting with more genuine global stewardship than the state they belong to.
It's a compelling argument. But, okay, the practicalities. If you don't have diplomats and you rely on elders and artists, how does this body actually do anything? The methods listed rituals, rankings, regenerative practices they sound, well, meaningful, but not like statecraft. What does a ranking look like here? Is it like a conscience score?
The methods are definitely meant to be transformative, not transactional, like a trade deal. So rituals might be these shared global acts of symbolic repair. Think formal, structured truth-telling ceremonies involving the actual peoples affected by conflict, not just their governments, to really acknowledge past harms. The idea is these acts would carry real moral weight.
Okay, maybe. And the rankings. We're used to GDP, military power.
These would measure relational things. Imagine a global kinship index, ranking nations or communities on stuff like internal social trust or cross-border cultural projects or how well they integrate ancestral knowledge into policy. A low rank wouldn't trigger sanctions in the traditional sense.
But maybe huge moral pressure within this CAGS network.
Exactly, massive cultural pressure. And then regenerative practices would be the what next. Things like joint environmental projects, or maybe shared programs to revitalize cultures damaged by conflict, all designed to improve those relationship rankings.
Which brings us to the absolute crunch point, enforcement. This body has no army, no economic leverage. It talks about symbolic enforcement and relational diplomacy. I mean, isn't that dangerously naive? History kind of suggests that when push comes to shove, only hard power sanctions, force, actually stops bad actors.
Look, that's the number one skeptical challenge, absolutely. The speech suggests symbolic enforcement works by making moral gravity the weapon, not physical force. It leans heavily on social and cultural exclusion. If a government gets called out by this global tribunal of elders and respected artists, the pressure comes from shame, from losing standing, from being essentially kicked out of the global kinship club.
But that only works if the actors actually care about being in that club, right? And if they value that kind of legitimacy.
Precisely. It's built on the premise that deep down, all humans, even powerful leaders, crave social acceptance and moral validation. Plus, there's another structural bit. These distributed healing cells, they aren't big UN offices in capital cities. They're proposed as small, local teams embedded right in communities dealing with conflict. They'd work on mediation and healing directly with the people involved, potentially bypassing national governments altogether.
Okay, this whole thing sounds like a fascinating, maybe beautiful counter-narrative to power politics. But the speech itself asks the big why now question. Why does the head of state argue we need this radical overhaul right now? Why can't the UN just, evolve?
And the answer given connects CAGS directly to the kind of crises we're facing today. What's interesting is the argument that our biggest problems aren't just political anymore, they're bigger. The speech points to things like climate collapse, cultural fragmentation, digital alienation. These aren't just policy challenges needing new treaties. They are fundamentally civilizational crises.
Civilizational crises, meaning they threaten the basic fabric of how we live together, our shared meaning. How does the current system fail there?
The speech draws a really stark contrast in origins. The UN, it says, was inevitably built in the shadow of war. Its whole design is geared towards preventing another world war, managing state competition through rules, sovereignty, deterrence. It's built to manage conflict.
Right, makes sense. Post-WWII context.
But CAGS, the argument goes, needs to be built in the light of shared legacy. Its purpose isn't just preventing bad things, but actively restoring good things: collaboration, kinship, long-term wisdom. So one system manages conflict to maintain order, the other seeks to restore relationships to find shared purpose.
That contrast managing conflict versus restoring purpose really crystallizes the whole idea, doesn't it? These modern crises, like the division fueled by social media or the sheer scale of climate change, they feel like crises of relationship with each other, with the planet, maybe even with ourselves. So you need a body focused purely on mending those relationships, not just enforcing old rules.
Yeah, and the speech sums that up beautifully. It says, the future isn't just a place we're heading towards, it's a relationship we need to restore. Bringing in indigenous nations and elders, that's restoring the relationship with history, with deeper time, prioritizing culture and conscience. That's about restoring the relationship with shared values.
And the tribunal for future generations. Restoring the relationship with time itself, with those who come after us. Wow. It's a very holistic, almost spiritual take on global affairs. Hashtag outro.
So to kind of wrap up this whole grand vision, the head of state leaves us with a simple but powerful pairing for global governance going forward. Let the UN keep doing its essential job to codify, to be the spine of international law, regulating state behavior. And let CAGS start the work to sanctify, to be the soul of kinship, inspiring shared moral action and deeper connection.
And it's offered with humility, right? Not as a definitive answer or a challenge to the UN, but explicitly as a seed. An invitation to maybe start growing something new alongside the structures we already have. So what does all this mean for you, listening to this, as you think about the future of how nations and peoples interact?
Well, we spent this whole deep dive contrasting the mechanisms of law with the mechanisms of, let's say, culture and spirit. And that really throws up a fundamental question for you to mull over. Just how effective can a body relying purely on symbolic enforcement actually be? Especially when dealing with actors who seem completely indifferent to moral shame or losing kinship points. And you see, push that further. Think about the practical role artists, elders, spiritual figures could realistically play not instead of, but alongside generals and diplomats in actually mediating and healing those deep, persistent conflicts between nations. This whole proposal really forces us to question who we trust and what methods we value when we're trying to mend a fractured world.
Madam Chair, esteemed delegates, honored elders, and citizens of the world, I greet you with reverence and resolve. I stand before you today not only as the representative of my nation, but as a daughter of humanity, entrusted with the sacred duty to speak truth, even when it trembles. For years, my country and our neighboring state have been entangled in a painful dispute. It has cost lives, dignity, and the quiet joy of ordinary families. The United Nations has responded with care. Resolutions have been issued, condemnations voiced, and calls for peace repeated. We are grateful. We honor your efforts. But the truth remains. The suffering continues. Resolutions, however noble, do not always reach the soil where pain grows. Sanctions, however firm, do not always soften hearts. And diplomacy, however skilled, cannot always mend what was broken in spirit. So today, I rise not only to report a crisis, but to propose a companion to this great institution, a parallel entity, born not of rivalry, but of resonance. Proposal, the Conscience Alliance for Global Stewardship, CAGS. Let us imagine, and now begin to build, a new intergovernmental body that complements the UN by addressing what it cannot always reach: the wounds between peoples, not just governments; the erosion of trust, not just the violation of treaties; the silence of culture, not just the noise of politics. CAGS would be a forum of conscience, a network of kinship, and a tribunal for future generations. It would include elders, artists, scientists, and spiritual leaders, not just diplomats; cities, tribes, and indigenous nations, not just sovereign states; rituals, rankings, and regenerative practices, not just resolutions. It would operate through symbolic enforcement, relational diplomacy, and distributed healing cells embedded in communities. Why we need CAGS? Because the crises we face, climate collapse, cultural fragmentation, digital alienation, are not merely political, they are civilizational. Because the UN, for all its wisdom, was built in the shadow of war. CAGS must be built in the light of shared legacy. Because the future is not only a place we reach, it is a relationship we restore. Madam Chair, fellow leaders, let us not wait for perfection. Let us begin with vision and humility. Let the UN continue to codify. Let CAGS begin to sanctify. Let both walk together, one as the spine of law, the other as the soul of kinship. I offer this proposal not as a challenge, but as a gift, not as a solution, but as a seed. May we water it together. Thank you.